It was in the vast halls of the Vatican, where shadows gather along frescoed walls, that Lucrezia Borgia stood one evening, golden hair cascading over her pale shoulders, her eyes lowered yet unblinking, as the murmurs of Rome moved like smoke beyond the door. Whispers clung to her name, whispers of beauty laced with venom, of love bound in chains, of desires both dark and unspoken. Some said she was an innocent, others that she was an enchantress, and still more that she was both. Yet all agreed on one truth. Wherever her name was uttered, silence followed, as though the air itself listened for what might come next. Welcome, dear listener, to this long wandering of memory and shadow. As you drift into the story, you may share in the circle of remembrance by telling us in the comments where and when you are listening. Each place and time becomes part of a global memory, woven together across the years. And if you wish to help preserve these tales, do not forget to subscribe to this channel, that the stories may continue their slow unfolding. Now let us begin. The child who would one day become a figure of whispered scandal and painted myth was born in April of 1480 into a world where power clothed itself in silks and daggers alike. Lucrezia Borgia entered life in the city of Rome, a city both eternal and ever restless, where the stones remembered empires, yet the present was ruled by ambition, intrigue, and the restless hunger of men. Her father was Rodrigo Borgia, a man of Spanish blood already powerful within the church, who would in time ascend to the papacy as Alexander VI. Her mother, Vannozza dei Catani, was of a more shadowed standing, a woman of worldly charm whose presence was always half acknowledged and half concealed within the corridors of power. Lucrezia's earliest years were not unlike those of other children born into privilege, yet she grew under the peculiar light of a family whose name already stirred both admiration and suspicion. The Borgias were foreigners in Rome, Spanish among Italians, and their wealth and ambition made them objects of envy. Yet for a little girl, these were matters far beyond the comprehension of her world. Her first senses were of candlelight flickering against tapestries, of voices rising and falling in the rhythm of Latin prayers, and of the gentle rustle of her mother's dress when she bent to lift her from a cradle. We may ask ourselves what impressions form in the mind of a child born amidst such forces. Did she notice the glances cast upon her father when he entered a chamber, the mixture of respect and calculation? Did she hear the sharpness that sometimes cut through words, meant to sound soft? Perhaps she only knew, in those first tender years, the warmth of touch, the patterns of ritual, the play of sunlight through high windows, and yet within that innocence lay the seeds of a destiny that would not allow her to remain untouched by the ruthless currents of Rome. Her education began early, for a daughter of Rodrigo could not remain idle. Tutors were summoned to instruct her in languages, in music, in the arts of conversation and decorum. Latin verses were read to her. Melodies from the lute and harp filled the air until her voice itself became an instrument praised for its clarity. Such accomplishments were not mere ornaments, but tools, sharpened for the role she was expected to play. For in that age, a daughter was often no more than a key, opening doors of alliance between families, kingdoms, and powers greater than her own. And so, even as she traced her letters upon parchment, even as she listened to tales of saints and heroes, the shape of her life was already being carved by unseen hands. The girl who leaned over, illuminated manuscripts, her hair glinting in the candlelight, was also the girl whose name would one day be written into contracts of marriage, annulment, and political strategy. What thoughts moved within her as she learned to write her own name with care? Did she feel pride, or did she sense that her name belonged to others more than it belonged to herself? Rome itself was a teacher as much as her tutors. The streets echoed with processions, with drums and trumpets, with the solemn hymns of holy days and the coarse laughter of markets. The smell of incense lingered near the basilicas, while the acrid smoke of tanners and forges rose from the lower quarters. In such a city, contrasts were everywhere, the sacred and the profane, the glorious and the sordid. A child raised within its walls could not help but absorb these contradictions, even if only as half-understood impressions. Perhaps it was here that the foundation was laid for the strange duality that would follow her all her life, the blending of purity and corruption, of innocence and suspicion. Her father Rodrigo, though outwardly a man of the cloth, was never solely a servant of faith. His ambitions burned like a hidden fire. He gathered wealth, cultivated allies, and planned for ascendancy. In this pursuit, his children, Lucrezia among them, were both beloved and useful. He was said to have shown genuine affection for her, to delight in her presence. Yet affection in such a man could never be separated from calculation. When he smiled upon her, was it the smile of a father, or also that of a strategist, imagining what doors her beauty and charm might open in the future? The truth is hidden, perhaps even from himself. And so, in these years of childhood, Lucrezia was shaped not only by books and songs, but by the gaze of those who measured her worth, as though she were a jewel to be displayed, weighed, and exchanged. Her life had already begun to carry the double edge, on one side the softness of youth, on the other the cold steel of politics. There are tales, though they may be embellished, of her playing in gardens where fountains whispered, of her laughter echoing among roses and lemon trees. In such moments she might have seemed no different from any other girl, chasing butterflies, braiding flowers into her hair. But beyond the garden walls the city plotted and schemed, and beyond even that, Europe itself shifted like a restless sea. France looked toward Italy with hungry eyes, Spain sought to strengthen its influence, and the Italian states themselves were ever at war with one another, alliances forming and breaking like waves upon a shore. In such a world, could a child truly remain untouched? Perhaps in the stillness of night she listened to voices through half-open doors, her father speaking with emissaries, her mother whispering to attendants. And though the words might not yet have meaning, the tone carried enough weight to etch unease into her mind. The music of politics is heard before it is understood, a symphony of threat and promise that children of power learn by instinct long before comprehension. Thus we arrive at the closing of her first decade, when the girl Lucrezia had already learned grace, modesty, and the arts of speech, yet when shadows had already begun to stretch across her path. She was no ordinary child, nor could she ever be. Her fate was bound to the name she carried, a name that even then drew both reverence and suspicion within Rome. The bells of the city tolled across the night sky, their echoes fading into silence. It was the sound that marked both prayer and passage, and it lingered over her cradle years as a solemn reminder that each moment carried her forward into a destiny written not by her, but by those who ruled around her. And as those bells faded, the story turned toward the rise of her father, the moment when Rodrigo Borgia would claim the throne of St. Peter, and when the innocence of a daughter would be bound forever to the power of a pope. The bells of Rome, fading into silence, gave way to another sound within the chambers of power, the rustle of papal robes brushing against marble floors, the soft footfalls of cardinals moving in deliberate procession, the echo of whispered Latin prayers mingling with ambition unspoken. It was in the summer of 1492 that Rodrigo Borgia ascended the throne of St. Peter, taking the name Alexander VI, and with that act the destiny of his daughter was bound more tightly than ever to the fate of Rome itself. For Rome in those days was no quiet city of devotion, but a living theater of power, where the papacy was both a spiritual crown and a political prize. The election of Alexander VI was achieved not through miracle, but through the skillful weaving of promises, favors, and wealth. The conclave of cardinals, locked within the walls of the Sistine Chapel, had been touched by his influence as surely as the frescoes above were touched by the hand of artists. Some whispered that gold had passed from his coffers to theirs, that alliances of convenience were struck in the shadows. And when at last the white smoke rose into the sky, it carried not only the fragrance of burnt ballots, but the scent of calculation fulfilled. In that moment, Lucrezia's world shifted. She was no longer the daughter of a powerful cardinal, but of the Pope himself, the vicar of Christ, ruler of Rome, arbiter of kingdoms. Yet if this new height gave her a crown of light, it also placed upon her a weight of expectation. For the Borgias were not loved by all. Their Spanish origin set them apart from the proud families of Italy, and their bold accumulation of wealth and influence drew suspicion and envy. The child Lucrezia, though still only 12 years old, became a symbol, her very existence both a resource and a liability in the eyes of her father. Imagine her walking through the corridors of the apostolic palace, the tapestries now grander, the frescoes richer, the attendants more numerous. Perhaps she marveled at the transformation, or perhaps she felt the sudden gravity pressing upon her slender form. Her father's eyes, proud and calculating, rested upon her with a dual gaze, affection for his daughter and foresight for the role she would play in the intricate game of alliances. For in that age, a daughter was a bridge, her hand in marriage a passageway through which kingdoms could be joined or divided. Thus began the weaving of her future into the fabric of diplomacy. Even as she continued her lessons in language and grace, suitors' names were spoken in her presence, sometimes openly, sometimes in hushed tones, meant to reach her ears as though by accident. The Sforza of Milan, the Orsini of Rome, the princes of Naples, all were names that hung in the air like distant thunder, shaping the horizon of her young life. What did she feel, hearing these names? Did she imagine the faces of men she had never seen, or did she close her mind against such visions, content for a time to dwell in the innocence of her books and music? The truth may be hidden, but what we do know is that Rodrigo, now Alexander, was not slow in using his daughter's presence as a token of his strength. Already he spoke of betrothals. Already letters were sent across Italy, bearing her name alongside his. She, who had once braided flowers in a garden, now became a thread woven into treaties, a name written into drafts of power. Her life was no longer her own, but the property of her family's ambition. And yet, beneath the surface of politics, there was another current, the affection of a father who, for all his ambition, is said to have cherished his daughter's company. He would have her near him, not hidden away. She attended gatherings, banquets, and audiences, her presence a softening of his stern image, her beauty and composure a reflection of his success. Those who saw her spoke of a serene face, of hair like sunlight upon silk, of a demeanor that was at once modest and captivating. Such qualities did not go unnoticed in a court where every gesture was measured, every glance interpreted. Rome itself watched. The city was a furnace of gossip, where taverns, markets, and palaces alike hummed with speculation. Who would claim the hand of the Pope's daughter? What secret plans lay behind her composed smile? Already whispers of poison and intrigue surrounded her family, though whether they touched her personally was another matter. In an age when rumor was as powerful as fact, the innocence of a girl could be transformed by the tongue of envy into the mask of a seductress. Did she know even then how fragile reputation could be? Did she feel the weight of eyes upon her, seeing not who she was but who they imagined her to be? It is tempting to look upon her in these years as a pawn, and in many ways she was. But pawns, even in the game of chess, are not without their subtle power. They move slowly, one step at a time, yet sometimes they reach the far side of the board and are transformed. Perhaps within Lucrezia's quiet gaze, there already lay an awareness, dim but growing, that her role would not be merely passive. She learned to listen, to smile without revealing, to be present without speaking too much. Such qualities, though gentle on the surface, are the very tools by which influence may one day be exercised. In the Vatican, the sound of her father's robe sweeping across marble signified not only his authority, but hers by extension. When he entered a hall, she followed in his shadow, her presence reminding all that his bloodline was secured, his dynasty embodied in flesh and promise. For Alexander VI, the papacy was not only a spiritual crown, but a throne upon which he sought to build a legacy, and Lucrezia was part of that vision. Outside, Rome shifted restlessly. The air was thick with both devotion and decay. Pilgrims knelt at holy shrines, even as mercenaries prowled the alleys. Artists painted visions of paradise while assassins waited in shadowed corners. The Eternal City was at once heaven's gateway and a den of wolves. Within such a place, a girl's innocence was never safe, not from malice, nor from envy, nor from the designs of her own kin. Thus her youth slipped quietly into a new phase, marked by her father's ascension and her own transformation from child to political figure. The days of wandering gardens and chasing butterflies gave way to evenings spent in candlelit halls, where conversations swirled with names of dukes and princes, and where her silence was as meaningful as any word. As night fell upon the Vatican and torches flickered along its walls, the rustle of papal robes still echoed in her ears. It was the sound of power, of destiny, of a life already claimed. She could not yet know the scandals and sorrows that awaited her, but even then she must have felt the slow tightening of invisible threads. And so this chapter closes with the image of a young girl standing beside her father, her hands folded, her eyes calm, while the world of men measured her worth in gold and kingdoms. Outside, the night was still, broken only by the faint whisper of cloth upon stone, as though even silence carried the sound of ambition's garment brushing against the corridors of Rome. The rustle of papal robes faded into silence, and in their place another sound emerged, softer, more fragile. The flicker of a candle burning low in a chamber, its wax flowing downward like the hours of youth slipping away. It was in this gentle yet relentless decline of time that Lucrezia Borgia's first betrothals were whispered into being, her childhood dissolving into the fragile promises of alliance and marriage. For in the years that followed her father's coronation as Alexander, the name of Lucrezia was carried across Italy not merely as the name of a daughter, but as the seal of potential treaties. The Pope, ambitious and ever restless, sought to strengthen his position among the great powers of the peninsula. To the Borgias, family and politics were never separate. Every son was a soldier or cardinal, every daughter a bridge toward another throne. And thus, Lucrezia, scarcely beyond her girlhood, was placed into the currents of negotiation, her smile imagined as balm, her hand as contract. The first betrothals were spoken with the haste of ambition. One of the earliest suitors proposed was from the Spanish royal house, a cousin to Ferdinand of Aragon, whose hand might have tethered Rome more closely to the crown of Spain. Yet whispers of rivalry and shifting winds caused such plans to wither before they bore fruit. Another name emerged, the son of a Neapolitan nobleman, yet Naples itself trembled beneath the shadow of French ambition. And what is a betrothal if the kingdom it binds is already threatened by conquest? Thus one plan after another flickered like the candle's flame, bright for a moment, then extinguished by the breath of circumstance. And all the while Lucrezia grew. At 12, she was no longer a child, yet not yet a woman. She moved gracefully through the papal halls, her golden hair braided with care, her gowns chosen to reflect both modesty and quiet splendor. Those who saw her spoke of beauty, but not the kind that struck with sudden force. It was a gentler beauty, unfolding slowly, her eyes carrying both light and reserve. The candle flame suited her well, delicate, wavering yet capable of illuminating a chamber with its quiet glow. Her first formal betrothal came at the age of 11, when her father arranged her engagement to Don Cherubino Juan de Canteles, of a noble Spanish family. Yet the distance of lands and the shifting tides of diplomacy soon ended this promise. Another engagement was made, then broken, this time to Gaspare of Procida, a Neapolitan noble. Again the promise dissolved. What must Lucrezia have felt? Her name signed upon papers that were later torn, her fate spoken aloud and then unspoken, her future offered and then withdrawn. Did she feel confusion, or did she already learn to wear a mask of composure, hiding whatever thoughts stirred within? For such was the life of daughters in that age. They were pawns in a game of greater kings, and yet pawns, though moved by others, often hold the tension of the game within them. Each failed betrothal left behind not only frustration for her father, but also the quiet layering of experience for Lucrezia. She learned, perhaps, that promises could vanish, that affection was not required for a union to be made, that her life was a thread woven not by her own hands. At last, however, one arrangement settled more firmly than the others. Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro, was chosen as her husband. He was 26 years of age, seasoned by life while she was only 13, still at the threshold of adolescence. The Sforza family of Milan was powerful, and their alliance desirable. With this union, Alexander VI hoped to strengthen his ties to northern Italy, balancing against the shifting weight of Naples and the looming specter of France. Thus the engagement was confirmed, and Lucrezia's hand was given not for love, but for strategy. The candle burned lower as preparations began. Rome itself buzzed with anticipation. The wedding of the Pope's daughter was no ordinary ceremony. It was an event that symbolized power, that drew the eyes of courts across Europe. Gold was spent lavishly. Fabrics of silk and brocade arrived from distant lands. Musicians rehearsed their melodies, and the streets were prepared for processions. Amidst all this, Lucrezia herself remained a figure both central and silent. What did she think as her gown was fitted, as jewels were placed upon her neck, as words of contract were recited in halls where she was but a presence? Not a voice? We may never know, yet the mind wanders to her chamber on the night before her wedding. A candle flickering low, her reflection in a polished mirror, her hands resting upon the fabric of her gown. Was there excitement, fear, or resignation? Did she whisper a prayer, asking for strength, or did she simply close her eyes, surrendering to what had already been decided? The silence of that moment, broken only by the faint crackle of the candle, lingers in imagination more than any record of words could. The wedding itself was held in June of 1493, a spectacle of splendor. Lucrezia, still barely more than a girl, was adorned in finery, her face serene, her movements measured. Giovanni Sforza stood beside her, a man of ambition yet already bound to her father's will. Guests feasted, musicians played, and Rome spoke of the alliance forged that day. Yet beneath the surface, whispers continued. Some said Giovanni was too weak to match the strength of the Borgias. Others suggested that Lucrezia, with her serene beauty, would one day hold influence beyond the reach of her husband. For Lucrezia, the candle burned on, illuminating not only the path ahead, but also the shadows it cast. Marriage was meant to be the beginning of her womanhood, yet in truth, it was the continuation of her role as pawn in her father's design. And though she smiled, though she moved with grace, Though her presence charmed those who watched, the silence within her chamber remained. The flame bent and wavered, as if uncertain whether to burn more brightly or to fade. It is here that the story leaves us, with the image of a young bride in the glow of candlelight, her life seemingly illuminated, yet already shadowed by the politics that surrounded her. The wax melted slowly, dripping onto the polished surface below, a reminder that time passes and innocence with it. Beyond the chamber walls, Rome waited, its whispers ready to rise with every flicker of scandal, with every rumor of intrigue. And as the candle at last burned low, extinguishing itself in a curl of smoke, it left behind not only the darkness of a room, but the uncertain dawn of a life entwined with power, scandal, and survival. That smoke curled upward like a question, carrying us forward to the closing of her first marriage and the breaking of vows that would mark her story with its first true scandal. The candle that had burned low gave one final tremor before it was consumed, and from the smoke it left behind there appeared another image, as if memory itself reshaped the scene. A half-closed doorway with a narrow line of light seeping through. What lies behind such a door? Is it safety, or is it a hidden room of secrets? For Lucrezia Borgia, that doorway became the symbol of her first marriage to Giovanni Sforza, a union entered with ceremony yet haunted by whispers, almost from the beginning. She had been married scarcely more than a girl, 13 years old, her face still marked by the softness of youth. Giovanni was a man grown, 26, bearing the weight of experience, ambition, and responsibility. In theory, the alliance was strong. The Sforza family of Milan was among the most powerful in Italy, and their bond to the Pope seemed to promise stability in a land ever shifting beneath the feet of its rulers. Yet theory and reality rarely walked the same path. Behind the half-closed door, where Rome's courtiers peered through narrow openings, discontent brewed almost from the first day. In the public eye, the marriage was celebrated with splendor. Banquets were held, gold was lavished upon the ceremonies, and guests from across Italy bore witness to the Pope's daughter united with one of the peninsula's noble houses. Yet in the private halls of the Vatican, murmurs began to rise. Giovanni was not regarded as a man of great strength or cunning. Some whispered he was weak, more suited to small lordship than to the mighty stage of Rome. Others claimed he lacked the force of will required to stand beside the Borgias, whose name was spoken with awe and dread. For Lucrezia, the early days of marriage must have been a strange blend of ritual and uncertainty. She was expected to carry herself with the dignity of a bride, to smile in banquets, to move with grace through audiences, to serve as the visible proof of alliance. Yet what lay within her own heart remains hidden, like a chamber kept behind the half-closed door. Did she seek tenderness from Giovanni? Did she feel affection growing, or was her presence beside him always tinged with the knowledge that she was more her father's daughter than her husband's wife? There are hints that the marriage was not harmonious. Giovanni himself, though allied with the Pope, found his position increasingly strained as Alexander VI sought new and greater alliances. The Pope's ambitions did not rest, and alliances once useful could become burdens when the winds of politics shifted. The French moved southward with the ambition of Charles V, and the Pope's strategy turned toward them. Milan's position grew precarious, and by extension, so did Giovanni's. A husband who had once been valuable as an ally began to look more like a liability. It was in this shifting climate that whispers of dissatisfaction reached beyond the papal chambers. Some said the marriage was never truly consummated, that Giovanni was incapable, that Lucrezia remained untouched. Whether this was truth or convenient rumor, it became the tool by which Alexander sought to dissolve the union. For the Pope, no alliance was sacred if it ceased to serve his ambition. And so, scarcely after 4 years of marriage, Alexander declared that the union must end. But to dissolve a marriage in that age required more than decree. It required reason, and reasons could wound as deeply as blades. The claim put forth was that Giovanni was impotent, incapable of fulfilling the duties of husband. Such an accusation was not merely personal, but public, a humiliation that branded him with shame. Giovanni resisted, declaring that the charge was false, that he was slandered by a pope who sought to discard him. In his bitterness, he struck back with words that would echo for centuries. He accused the Borgias of sins darker than politics, of incest between father, daughter, and brother. Thus, from the half-closed doorway, a flood of rumor burst forth. Rome, already fertile ground for gossip, seized upon the accusation. Were the Pope and his daughter bound by unholy ties? Was Cesare, Lucrezia's brother, more than a brother in his affection? Or were these merely the desperate slanders of a man cast aside, seeking to wound the family that humiliated him? The truth lies shrouded, perhaps lost forever, yet the whispers clung to Lucrezia's name, and even in her silence, she was made the center of scandal. Imagine her in those days, retreating into her chamber, the door half closed, hearing her name carried through corridors, not as praise but as poison. She was still scarcely 17, yet the city spoke of her as though she were already an enchantress, a figure of corruption. Did she weep, or did she harden herself against such words? Did she feel herself a victim of men's ambitions, or did she recognize that in the game she was both pawn and symbol, innocence and weapon alike? The annulment was finally declared in 1497. Giovanni was cast aside, his honor wounded, his alliance broken. Lucrezia returned to her father's protection, her marriage dissolved not by death, but by decree. Yet even in her return, questions lingered. Was she relieved to be free of a husband who offered little affection or strength? Or did she feel the stain of rumor pressing upon her, a mark that no annulment could erase? What is most striking is that through it all, she remained silent in the records. We hear the voices of men, Giovanni railing against humiliation, Alexander declaring impotence, Cesare maneuvering in the shadows, but rarely the voice of Lucrezia herself. She moved like a figure in a painting, her expression serene, her presence graceful, yet her thoughts concealed. Behind the half-closed door, what words might she have whispered to herself, to God, to no one? The silence is as eloquent as any speech, and perhaps more haunting. Thus her first marriage ended, not in tragedy of blood, but in the tragedy of scandal and humiliation. A union meant to strengthen the Borgias dissolved into accusation, leaving behind a residue that would follow her all her life. The door was never fully opened, never fully closed, and in that narrow gap lay the birth of her reputation as both pawn and siren, victim and villain. And as the door creaked upon its hinges, closing slowly, another sound arose to mark the passage of time, the sharp, brittle twang of a lute string snapping in the night, its sudden break leaving silence that trembled in the air. It is with that sound that we must move forward to the next moment of her life, when death itself entered the story, and the family's rivalries would draw her deeper still into the shadows of Rome. The lute string snapped in the night, its sudden twang vibrating for a moment before dissolving into silence, leaving the air unsettled, as though something delicate had been broken and could not be repaired. So it was with Lucrezia's first marriage, a bond stretched thin by politics until it broke, leaving behind a silence filled not with peace, but with uneasy whispers. For the annulment of her union with Giovanni Sforza did not bring clarity. It brought humiliation, accusation, and a new chapter of rumor that would forever cling to her name. The official declaration was simple. Giovanni was incapable of consummating the marriage, his body unable to perform the duties of a husband. Yet what was simple on parchment became venom in the mouths of courtiers and citizens alike. To accuse a nobleman of impotence was to strip him not only of his dignity, but of his very manhood. Giovanni raged against the claim, denouncing the Pope's decree as slander, and in his bitterness he struck with words sharper than swords. He accused the Borgias of incest, declaring that Lucrezia's father and brother both shared an intimacy that was unholy. It was a charge meant not only to wound but to damn, and Rome, ever eager for scandal, seized upon it like fire leaping to dry wood. Thus Lucrezia, scarcely 17, became the subject of whispers darker than any she had yet known. In the markets, in the taverns, in the palaces of her father's rivals, her name was spoken not with admiration, but with insinuation. Was she the innocent daughter of the Pope, discarded by an unworthy husband? Or was she the hidden temptress, the plaything of her own family, an emblem of corruption seated at the very heart of Christendom? The truth, as always, lay concealed behind walls and curtains, perhaps even hidden within her own silence, and silence was indeed her refuge. Rarely does her voice emerge in the records of this time. Instead, we see her only through the words of men who used her name as weapon or shield. Giovanni, wounded and desperate, hurled accusations. Alexander, calculating and relentless, brushed them aside as slander. Cesare, ambitious and cold, watched and waited, his gaze fixed upon horizons far beyond his sister's humiliation. Yet where is Lucrezia in all this? Perhaps sitting in her chamber, a lute upon her lap, the strings trembling beneath her fingers, until one breaks with a sound that mirrors the breaking of her life's first binding. The annulment was granted in December of 1497. Giovanni was dismissed, his alliance discarded, his honor forever tainted. Lucrezia returned to her father's household, her status intact in the eyes of power, yet altered in the eyes of rumor. She was now free, but freedom carried with it the heavy chains of speculation. Suitors would still come, for she was the Pope's daughter, and her beauty was undeniable. But behind each proposal lingered the shadow of whispered shame. And then, as if to deepen the gloom already gathered, death entered her family with brutal force. In June of 1497, Lucrezia's brother Juan, Duke of Gandia, was found murdered, his body pierced with wounds, abandoned in the Tiber. He had been the Pope's favorite son, the golden youth upon whom Alexander had hoped to build his dynasty. His death struck the family with a grief that was mingled with suspicion, for Rome was quick to ask, who had killed him, and why? The streets of the city buzzed with speculation. Some said it was the work of rival families, envious of the Borgias' rise. Others whispered darker theories, pointing to Cesare, Lucrezia's other brother, whose ambitions could not flourish while Juan lived. No proof was found, yet the rumor persisted, and in the shadow of Juan's death, Cesare soon abandoned his cardinal's robes to take up the sword, stepping into the role of warrior that had once belonged to his brother. What must Lucrezia have felt, caught between grief and fear? Her family was torn by suspicion, her name by scandal, her world by the sudden reminder that power and death walked hand in hand. Did she mourn Juan as a sister, weeping in the quiet of her chamber? Or did she, like so many of her kin, learn to fold sorrow into silence, wearing dignity as a mask while the city gossiped around her? The breaking of the lute strings seemed to echo in the loss of her brother. The sound of harmony shattered, leaving behind only discord. Yet even in grief, the machinery of politics did not rest. Alexander knew that the survival of his family depended not upon mourning, but upon new alliances. And so, once again, Lucrezia's hand was weighed and measured, her future calculated in terms of advantage and necessity. She would be wed again, her beauty and her name offered as the balm to heal the wounds of shifting alliances. But before that chapter opens, She stood in the silence of her broken marriage and her brother's death, a young woman surrounded by shadows, her innocence tested by the ruthless demands of family and fate. One cannot help but wonder whether, in those nights, she ever asked herself if her life was truly her own. Did she ever dream of walking through a door fully open into a world where love was chosen, not arranged? Or did she accept, even then, that her path was bound to corridors half-lit, where doors closed halfway, where voices whispered behind walls, where she would always be seen as more symbol than self? The answers drift into silence, just as the broken lute string no longer vibrates but lies slack, its voice forever stilled. And as silence filled her chamber, another sound arose to guide the story forward, the slow ripple of water beneath moonlight, black and restless, as though echoing the river where her brother's body was found. The Tiber carried away not only Juan's corpse, but also a fragment of the Borgia family's fragile unity, leaving Lucrezia to face the uncertain waters of her own fate. The ripples upon black water shimmered beneath the pale gaze of the moon, each circle spreading outward into the silence of the Roman night, as if carrying away secrets too heavy to remain still. So it was when the body of Juan Borgia was drawn from the Tiber in June of 1497, stabbed many times and left to drift in the current until fishermen stumbled upon the corpse. His death, cruel and deliberate, was more than the loss of a son and brother. It was a wound upon the Borgia family itself, a fracture that would bleed into every corner of their story. Lucrezia, scarcely past the dissolution of her marriage, was thrust from scandal into grief. Juan had been her brother, her companion in youth, and though their lives diverged beneath the weight of their father's ambitions, the bond of blood had not dissolved. What must it have been for her to hear that his body had been pulled from the river, pierced by steel and abandoned to the flow of dark waters? Did she collapse into tears, or did she retreat into that composure she had already begun to wear like armor? History cannot say. It can only leave us with the image of rippling water, reflecting both the moon and the shadow of betrayal. The city, ever restless, did not allow the family even the dignity of private grief. Rumor rose like a tide, for in Rome no death of a powerful man was ever taken as mere misfortune. Who had killed Juan? Was it a rival family, striking at Alexander VI through his son? Or was it, as some whispered, a deed from within, a brother's hand turned against a brother? Cesare's name was spoken often in such whispers. He, the cardinal bound by holy orders, had long been said to hunger for a more worldly role, one that his brother occupied with the sword. With Juan dead, Cesare cast off the red robes and took up the armor of a condottiere, stepping into the place that had once belonged to the slain. Whether he struck the blow or merely profited from it, Rome judged him guilty in spirit, if not in fact. For Lucrezia, this meant not only sorrow but fear. Her family was marked by suspicion, and she herself was bound to them more tightly than ever. She had been the subject of scandal in the annulment of her marriage, accused of shameful bonds that she may never have known, and now she was the sister of a murdered brother, and of another who was rumored to be the murderer. Such shadows darkened her name without her consent. In the eyes of Rome, she was no longer simply the Pope's daughter. She was a figure enmeshed in a web of sin, scandal, and blood. We may pause to ask ourselves, what was her inner world in those days? A young woman of 17 or 18, raised in palaces yet bound by chains unseen, watching as her family's name turned darker with each passing season. Did she pray in chapels for her brother's soul? Did she look upon Cesare with fear, admiration, or resignation? Did she feel herself trapped in a fate she could not escape, like a figure carved into stone, unable to move though the world shifted violently around her? The death of Juan did not weaken Alexander VI's resolve, but seemed to harden it. He wept, yes, and declared mourning, but soon enough his attention turned to survival, to the securing of his dynasty. Cesare was freed from the priesthood, becoming a soldier and statesman, while Lucrezia was prepared for another alliance, another marriage that might strengthen the Borgia hold upon Italy. For the Pope, grief could never outweigh politics. For Lucrezia, grief became another shadow to carry silently, and so her life moved forward, though always under the weight of the river's memory. The black water of the Tiber continued to flow, as rivers always do, indifferent to the secrets it had borne. But in her story, it remained a symbol of violence hidden beneath the surface, of loss that could not be spoken, of currents that carried her family ever deeper into intrigue. The ripples upon the water widened, carrying her onward toward a second marriage, toward another attempt at binding her fate to the designs of men. But as she moved toward this new chapter, the image of the river never left her. Each night it whispered beneath the moon, carrying away one brother, raising another, and reminding her that in the world of the Borgias, death was never far and family was never simple. The ripples shimmered, fading into the distance, until only the faint image of a smile behind a veil emerged in their place, a smile that hid as much as it revealed, belonging to a bride soon to wed again, even as shadows lengthened around her. The ripples of the black river faded, and in their place appeared the delicate image of a smile, half-veiled, hovering at the threshold between joy and concealment. It was the smile of a young bride once more, for after the loss of Juan and the dissolution of her first marriage, Lucrezia Borgia was bound again by her father's design. This time her hand was given to Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Becceglie, a youth of 17 years, himself kin to the royal house of Naples. The union was arranged with swiftness, for Alexander VI sought to strengthen ties with Naples, balancing the ever-shifting scales of Italian power. Alfonso was handsome, spirited, and of noble blood. Lucrezia, now approaching maturity, carried herself with the composure of a woman who had seen scandal and grief, yet remained outwardly serene. Together, they seemed at first a more fitting match than her earlier marriage to Giovanni Sforza. Alfonso brought youth to her side rather than the maturity of years, and some accounts suggest that affection bloomed between them. One imagines them walking together through the gardens of the Vatican, or later in Naples, where lemon trees scented the air and fountains sang gently in the courtyards. Lucrezia's veil would lift in the breeze, and Alfonso's smile might mirror hers. Two young figures bound not only by politics, but for a moment by the gentler bond of human fondness. Did she, for the first time, taste the sweetness of marriage not entirely devoid of affection? Did she sense within him a companion rather than merely a claimant of her hand? Yet even here, behind the veil of apparent harmony, shadows lingered, for Alfonso's position, though honorable, was precarious. His marriage to Lucrezia tied him to the Pope, yet it also tethered him to the shifting storms of Italian politics. France loomed once more, pressing claims to Naples, and Cesare, Lucrezia's brother, had begun to turn his eyes northward toward alliances with the French crown. What is a husband's love when it conflicts with a brother's ambition? Cesare Borgia was no longer a cardinal cloaked in red, but a warrior clad in armor, ruthless and relentless. To him, Alfonso was not merely his sister's husband, but a potential obstacle in his own designs. And so, though Lucrezia smiled behind her veil, she must have felt the gaze of her brother upon her, sharp and watchful, a reminder that her happiness could never be secure, while politics dictated every bond. In those early years of her marriage to Alfonso, Lucrezia bore a son, Rodrigo of Becceglie, named for her father. For a brief span, life seemed to offer her a gentler rhythm, the warmth of motherhood, the companionship of youth beside her, the sense of belonging not only to a dynasty, but to a family of her own making. Perhaps she cradled her child at night, humming soft melodies learned from tutors long ago, while Alfonso's footsteps echoed nearby. In such moments, the harsh whispers of Rome might have faded, replaced by the fragile comfort of domesticity. But comfort in the Borgia household was like morning mist, beautiful, fleeting, and easily burned away by the rising sun of ambition. Cesare's hunger for power deepened, and his plans led him ever closer to the French, whose enmity with Naples was unrelenting. Alfonso, by blood a prince of Naples, stood on the wrong side of this shifting alliance. His marriage to Lucrezia, once valuable, became inconvenient, even dangerous, in the eyes of Cesare. What must Lucrezia have felt, sensing the ground shifting beneath her once more? Did she cling more tightly to her husband, sensing that the bond between them was threatened not by quarrel but by daggers? Did she plead with her father, with her brother, to spare the life of the man who shared her days? Or did she, bound by silence, watch helplessly as events unfolded around her? In the summer of 1500, Alfonso was attacked upon the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, stabbed and left for dead. He survived the first assault, carried to chambers where Lucrezia tended him with devotion. She was said to have cared for him tirelessly, her hands steady, her face calm, her heart surely trembling within her. For once she resisted her family's designs, sheltering her husband against the violence of her brother. In those hours of tending wounds, perhaps she revealed her truest self, the woman beneath the layers of rumor and role, the wife and mother who longed only to preserve what was hers. But the Borgias were not a family that allowed survival where ambition demanded death. Weeks later, Alfonso was strangled in his chamber, most likely by agents of Cesare. Lucrezia, who had fought to keep him alive, found herself widowed, her son fatherless, her veil transformed from bridal silk to mourning black. The smile that had once hovered behind the veil was extinguished, replaced by silence deeper than words. This loss must have cut her more deeply than the annulment of her first marriage. Giovanni Sforza had been a stranger, an arrangement never consummated in affection. But Alfonso had been her companion, her partner in youth, and the father of her child. His death was not only political, but personal. And for Lucrezia, it marked another breaking of trust, another proof that love could not survive where power reigned. Rome, of course, whispered still. Some pitied her, others accused her of complicity, suggesting that no death could occur in her presence without her knowledge or assent. Truth and slander blended as they always did around her name, leaving her image blurred between victim and villain. Yet in the quiet of her chamber, where her child lay sleeping and her husband's absence was felt with every heartbeat, she must have known grief in its most human form. The veil that had once concealed her smile now concealed her sorrow. She walked the corridors with dignity, her composure unbroken, her silence as eloquent as ever. Behind her, the echo of her husband's murder followed, a reminder that in her family's world, affection was fragile and power inexorable. And as she passed beneath the arches of Rome, perhaps she heard another sound, blood dripping upon stone steps, left unwashed, a stain that would not fade. For Alfonso's death was not merely one life lost, but a mark upon her soul, binding her ever more tightly to the shadows that surrounded her name. The blood upon the stone steps dried in silence, its stain unwashed, its memory lingering long after the body had been carried away. It was not only Alfonso of Aragon whose life ended there, but also a chapter of fragile tenderness in Lucrezia Borgia's story. The steps remained, their cold surface a reminder of betrayal, their stain invisible to the eye, yet vivid in the imagination of those who whispered of it. To Rome, it was one more tale of Borgia cruelty. To Lucrezia, it was the severing of a bond she had fought to preserve, the extinguishing of a flame she had shielded with her own hands. After Alfonso's death in the summer of 1500, Lucrezia entered a new phase of her life, one that revealed more clearly than ever the dual nature of her existence, both pawn and participant, both victim and symbol of the family's ruthless ascent. Her grief, if she allowed herself to feel it openly, was muted by the need to continue forward, to maintain her place in a family that offered no refuge from politics. Behind her composed face, sorrow must have pressed heavily, but outwardly she moved with the same grace and poise that had long been her shield. Her brother Cesare, whose ambition had deepened with Juan's death and Alfonso's removal, now stood as her family's most powerful figure after their father. He had cast aside his red robes, taken up the sword, and allied himself with France. His campaigns in Romagna made him feared as much as admired, and his cruelty was whispered with the same awe as his victories. To be his sister was to live in the shadow of both his protection and his menace. For those who dared to cross her, Cesare was a warning. For those who sought to approach her, Cesare was a barrier. And for Lucrezia herself, Cesare was a force she could neither escape nor fully trust. It is said that in the months after Alfonso's death, she withdrew often into her chambers, where letters and prayers became her companions. Some letters written in her hand survive, and in them a voice softer and more human emerges, one that speaks of longing for quiet, for devotion, for an escape from the endless tide of rumor and violence. Yet even in those moments of private writing, one senses the awareness of an audience, the need to compose words that might survive beyond her immediate sorrow. Did she ever write what she truly felt without disguise? Or did she, even alone, wear the mask she had learned too well to wear? Rome, meanwhile, did not grant her silence. Gossip multiplied, as it always had. Some accused her of complicity in Alfonso's death, whispering that no deed of Cesare's could have been hidden from her. Others cast her as the eternal victim, the young widow grieving for the man her own brother had destroyed. Between these two extremes, her image flickered, never fixed, always uncertain. Was she the black widow of rumor or the grieving bride of sympathy? The answer depended on the teller, never on her own word, for she offered none. What is most striking about this period is the way her identity seemed to dissolve into the shadows of others. She was defined by her father's ambition, her brother's cruelty, her husband's murder. Yet in that dissolution, something paradoxical occurred. She became more mysterious, more fascinating, more enduring in memory than any of them. For Alexander was known as a corrupt pope, Cesare as a ruthless general, but Lucrezia was the enigma, the figure whose silence allowed imagination to paint her in whatever hues it wished. And yet, amid this darkness, another chapter was prepared for her. The pope, ever mindful of alliances, knew that his daughter must once again be bound in marriage, that her presence could still weave bonds between powers. Alfonso of Aragon was gone, Naples weakened, and France rising. A new husband must be found, one whose place in Italy would secure the Borgia's position as Alexander and Cesare expanded their dominion. Thus plans began to turn toward Ferrara, toward Alfonso d'Este, heir to one of the most refined and cultured courts of the Renaissance. But before that new union could be sealed, Lucrezia remained in Rome, her position precarious. She presided for a time over the Vatican in her father's absence, a sign of the trust he placed in her. Here, perhaps, she revealed a measure of her own ability, governing with composure, receiving visitors, issuing decrees in her father's name. The image of the grieving widow blended with that of a woman capable of authority, suggesting that she was not merely a vessel for alliances, but a presence in her own right. Still, The shadow of Alfonso's murder never faded. The stone steps where his blood had dried seemed to echo with every step she took. Each glance cast upon her in the streets or palaces of Rome carried with it the unspoken question: what did she know, and what part did she play? She could not answer, for any answer would only deepen the suspicion. And so she walked with silence, the veil of composure never lifted, while within her heart the weight of grief and rumor pressed heavily. In this silence her legend deepened. She became to some a saintly figure, patient and long-suffering, to others a sorceress of intrigue, complicit in every crime of her kin. Neither vision was true, and yet both endured, for the absence of her own words left room for invention. Perhaps she understood this, and chose silence as her greatest weapon. For words, once spoken, could be twisted. Silence could be shaped by others, but it could not be disproved. And so the years moved, carrying her from the bloodied steps of Rome toward the polished courts of Ferrara. But even as she prepared for this new journey, the memory of Alfonso lingered, a wound never healed. The image of his lifeless body, strangled in the chamber she had once guarded, remained like the stain upon stone that no washing could remove. The echo of his death led into the whispers of yet darker rumor, those tales of incest that Giovanni Sforza had once hurled in anger, now renewed in the city's gossip. Was the bond between Lucrezia and her brother Cesare one of affection or of sin? Was her father's tenderness toward her paternal or forbidden? Rome, hungry for scandal, believed what it wished, and her silence gave no contradiction. And as the blood upon the steps faded from sight, but not from memory, another image rose to carry the story forward. A closed window in the Vatican, its curtains trembling in the night breeze, concealing what lay within, suggesting both secrecy and fear. Behind such a window, Lucrezia's life was imagined by others, while she remained hidden, unseen, unknowable, the most mysterious figure in the drama of her family. The window in the Vatican remained closed, its curtains trembling gently in the night breeze, as though concealing words too dangerous to release into the open air. Behind such curtains, rumor was born and bred, nurtured in the half-light, until it spread like a contagion through the streets of Rome. And of all the rumors that ever clung to Lucrezia Borgia's name, none cast a darker shadow than the whispers of incest, that unholy suggestion that father and daughter, or brother and sister, shared bonds forbidden by both nature and heaven. The origin of these rumors can be traced to Giovanni Sforza, her discarded first husband, whose humiliation demanded revenge. Spurned by the annulment, accused of impotence, he struck back with the cruelest weapon he could fashion: accusation. In his bitterness, he declared that Lucrezia was not merely her father's daughter, but also his mistress, that she shared in secret what the public world condemned. He added, too, that her brother Cesare, ever close to her, was not only protector, but lover. To Giovanni, these words may have been nothing more than slander hurled in rage, but Rome, hungry for scandal, seized upon them as though they were truth. The city whispered in taverns, in markets, in the palaces of rivals. Could it be true? Was the Pope's daughter the vessel of her own father's desire? Was her brother's devotion to her bound not by kinship, but by passion? Each glance they shared in public, each tender word exchanged in family gatherings, became evidence to those who wished to believe. And in the imagination of the time, the Borgias were already figures of sin, their wealth, their power, their foreign blood, all conspiring to paint them as corrupt. What then was more fitting to such a tale than incest, the ultimate corruption, the secret hidden behind trembling curtains? Yet history, when asked for proof, offers none. No letter, no testimony, no document survives that confirms these whispers. They remain echoes, not facts. But echoes, when repeated long enough, become indistinguishable from truth in the minds of those who listen. Thus Lucrezia, whatever her innocence, bore the mark of sin in rumor. She was painted as temptress and victim both, her beauty said to conceal poison, her smile to mask forbidden love. What must it have been for her to live with such whispers? She who walked through the Vatican halls, who knelt in chapels, who cradled her child, must have felt the weight of eyes upon her, each gaze measuring, judging, suspecting. Did she feel shame or only weariness? Did she rage in private or accept that silence was her only refuge? To speak would have been to give the rumors more voice. To protest would have been to invite ridicule. And so she said nothing, allowing others to paint her image in whatever colors their envy or hatred demanded. Cesare, too, was silent. His devotion to his sister was undeniable. He entrusted her with tasks, sought her counsel, and treated her with an affection that to outsiders might have seemed unusual. Yet whether that affection was simply the bond of siblings or something darker remains forever obscured. Alexander, their father, was known to favor his children openly, to parade them with pride, to give them honors and wealth. To some, this was proof of his sin. To others, merely the indulgence of a father whose love exceeded caution. Thus the truth slips away, like water through fingers. What remains is the legend, the tale of the Borgia daughter who was said to embody both purity and corruption. Her beauty was praised in poems and letters, yet always with the undertone of danger. Some described her as angelic, others as demonic. Perhaps she was neither. Perhaps she was only a young woman caught between the affections of family and the envy of the world, transformed by rumor into a symbol she never sought to become. Behind the closed window, the curtains trembled still. Did she ever, in the solitude of her chamber, draw them aside to gaze upon the city, to wonder at the stories told of her beyond the walls? Did she ever lift her face to the night sky, asking silently why her name had become so entangled with shadows she had not created? Or did she close the curtains tighter, preferring the silence of concealment to the noise of slander? The whispers did not end, but they shifted as time carried her forward. For soon she would leave Rome, departing not only from the Vatican's walls, but from the city itself. Her father, her brother, saw new alliances to be made, and her hand once more was the key. Her third marriage, to Alfonso d'Este of Ferrara, would carry her northward, away from the city that had nurtured both her innocence and her scandal. Yet the rumors of incest would travel with her, for they were now inseparable from her name, embroidered into her legend as tightly as threads into cloth. Thus the image of the trembling curtain closes this chapter, concealing truth, releasing only rumor. And as the curtain falls still at last, another vision emerges. A long procession of carriages moving slowly northward, wheels creaking on the road, bearing Lucrezia away from Rome toward Ferrara, toward a new life that promised both refuge and renewed suspicion. The procession of carriages moved slowly northward, wheels creaking over uneven stones, horses snorting in the cool air as dust rose behind them like a veil of departure. Within one of those carriages sat Lucrezia Borgia, leaving behind Rome, the Vatican, and all the shadows that had gathered around her youth. She was bound for Ferrara to marry Alfonso d'Este, heir to the dukedom of one of Italy's most cultivated courts. The journey was long, but each turn of the wheel seemed to carry her further from the scandals that had haunted her in Rome. Though, in truth, such shadows travel more swiftly than any carriage, and no road is long enough to leave them behind. As the carriage passed through towns and villages, people came out to watch, some curious, some reverent, some whispering. To many, she was the Pope's daughter, a bride adorned with wealth and beauty, destined to bring prestige to the court of Ferrara. To others, she was already the figure shaped by rumor, the seductress of Rome, the woman whose smile concealed poison, whose family's name was synonymous with intrigue and blood. One wonders whether she heard those whispers through the closed windows, or whether she sat in silence, gazing out at fields and rivers, imagining the life that awaited her beyond the Po. The alliance with Ferrara was not easily won. Alfonso's family had at first resisted the marriage, for the Borgias were surrounded by scandal, and to join with them seemed a risk to honor. Yet Alexander VI's wealth and power were persuasive, and Cesare's growing might on the battlefield added weight to the proposal. In the end, politics triumphed over hesitation, as it so often did in that age, and the marriage was agreed. For Lucrezia, it was both escape and entrapment. Escape from Rome's suffocating atmosphere, entrapment in yet another union not of her own choosing. When she arrived in Ferrara in 1502, the city welcomed her with splendor. The court of the Este family was famed for its refinement, its patronage of poets, painters, and musicians. Here, unlike in Rome, she would be surrounded not only by politics, but also by art and culture, the softer expressions of human ambition. The streets were adorned with banners, bells rang, and processions honored her entry. She was no longer merely the Pope's daughter, but the Duchess of Ferrara, a position of dignity and authority. Yet the transition was not without tension. The Este family, proud and cautious, observed her carefully. They knew the reputation that had traveled with her, and they wondered whether the whispers of Rome would take root in their own city. Alfonso himself was wary at first. He was a man more devoted to military affairs than to the refinements of courtly life, a practical and somewhat austere figure who preferred the forge and the workshop to the dance hall. To him, Lucrezia may have seemed at first a figure of elegance but also of suspicion, an ornament whose presence was more political than personal. Still, time has its way of softening edges. In Ferrara, Lucrezia found a court where she could shape her own identity more freely than she had ever done in Rome. Surrounded by poets such as Ariosto, by musicians whose melodies filled the palace halls, she began to fashion an image not of scandal, but of grace, patronage, and intelligence. Letters from the time speak of her kindness, her generosity, her ability to create an atmosphere of refinement. Slowly, the city that had received her with hesitation began to admire her, to see in her not merely the daughter of Alexander VI, but a duchess in her own right. What must she have felt in those first months, walking through the gardens of Ferrara, hearing the soft trickle of fountains, smelling the roses and the orange blossoms? Did she sense at last a measure of peace, or did she always feel the shadow of her family upon her shoulders? Perhaps it was both. For even in Ferrara, the rumors of her past did not vanish. They lingered, spoken in corners, remembered by those who wished to tarnish her. Yet here, she had the chance to weave new threads, to create a legacy not wholly defined by her father and her brother. Her marriage to Alfonso, though not a union of passion, endured. He was not a man of tenderness, yet neither was he cruel. Their bond was one of mutual necessity, slowly turning to mutual respect. They shared children, though not all survived, and in the joys and sorrows of parenthood they found a common ground. For Lucrezia, the role of duchess was not simply ceremonial. She acted as intermediary in political matters. She corresponded with rulers. She managed aspects of the court. Her intelligence, often dismissed in Rome as secondary to her beauty, was recognized in Ferrara as a strength. Yet always, behind her, the past hovered. Visitors from Rome carried with them the echoes of old scandals, and poets across Europe continued to weave her into tales of corruption and seduction. She could not control what was said beyond her walls, but within them she could cultivate a different truth, a truth of culture, refinement, and quiet authority. Perhaps she understood with the wisdom of experience that one cannot erase a reputation once it is set, but one can live in such a way that the reputation becomes a mask, while the true self works silently behind it. The procession of carriages that had brought her northward thus marked not only a physical journey, but also a symbolic passage, from pawn of papal politics to Duchess of Ferrara, from scandal of Rome to patroness of culture. Yet the road was not free of hardship, and her story was far from complete. The carriages may have carried her into new light, but shadows traveled with them, following unseen, waiting to surface again. And as the carriages rolled to a halt within Ferrara's gates, the sound of wheels upon stone faded into a gentler image. A faint melody drifting through palace gardens, the notes of a lute or harp carried upon the evening air, blending with the scent of flowers. It was in such melodies that Lucrezia began to weave her new life, one of music, poetry, and cautious dignity, though beneath the harmony the old dissonance still remained. The faint melody drifted through the palace gardens, a lute's soft notes mingling with the fragrance of roses and jasmine, carried upon the evening air of Ferrara. It was in such moments that Lucrezia Borgia, now Duchess, began to fashion a life far different from the one she had known in Rome. The sound of strings, gentle and deliberate, contrasted with the sharper echoes of gossip that had long pursued her. Here, within the Este court, she found space to cultivate not scandal but beauty, not suspicion but patronage. Ferrara, in the early years of the 16th century, was a city alive with refinement. The Este family had long been patrons of poets, scholars, and artists, and their court was famed as one of the most cultivated in Italy. Ariosto would one day compose verses here. Music flourished in the chapels and salons, and painting adorned the walls of palaces with color and light. Into this world Lucrezia stepped, bringing with her not only the wealth and power of her name, but also a natural grace that won admiration even from those who had once doubted her. She attended gatherings where verses were recited, her presence inspiring poets to craft lines of praise. They compared her hair to sunlight, her eyes to gentle skies, her voice to music itself. Whether these praises were sincere or courtly, exaggeration mattered little. They became part of the tapestry of her image, reshaping her from the infamous daughter of Rome into the cultured Duchess of Ferrara. To musicians she offered patronage, to convents she extended generosity, and to scholars she opened the door of her court. Her influence was not loud but quiet, woven into the daily life of Ferrara like the faint melody that floated on the night air. And yet, even here the whispers did not vanish. Visitors from other courts still carried tales of her family's infamy, repeating the old rumors of poison, incest, and betrayal. Beyond Ferrara, she remained a figure of suspicion, her name linked inevitably to the darker legends of the Borgias. But within Ferrara, she began to construct another truth. To the people of the city, she became a patroness, a mother, a woman of dignity who walked among them with humility despite her station. Accounts from Ferrara speak of her kindness, her willingness to intercede for those in need, her devotion to works of charity. It was as though the city chose to see in her not the mask of Rome, but the face she presented in their midst. What must it have felt like for her? To walk in gardens where music played, to host gatherings where poets sang her praise, knowing that beyond the city's walls the world still imagined her as a poisoner, a temptress, a sinner? Did she feel peace, or did she feel the constant duality of two images, one she could shape and one she could never escape? Perhaps she understood that both were true in their own way, not as fact but as perception, and that her life would always be lived between them. Her relationship with Alfonso d'Este remained steady, if not deeply affectionate. He was a man devoted to his work in military and technical pursuits, more at home in the foundries where cannons were forged than in the salons where poets recited. Yet he respected her, and together they managed the responsibilities of their station. Their marriage produced several children, though many were lost in infancy, each loss adding another thread of sorrow to her life. Still, she carried herself with composure, her public image never faltering, her private grief concealed behind the serenity she had long mastered. The Este court grew accustomed to her presence, and over time the doubts that had clouded her arrival dissipated. She became not only accepted but admired, her role as duchess embraced by the people. Even rivals and skeptics conceded that she conducted herself with dignity, her household run with order, her court marked by culture and refinement. The Ferrara she helped shape was one of music, poetry, and elegance, a city that stood as a beacon of Renaissance grace. And so the faint melody drifting through the gardens was more than music. It was a symbol of transformation, of a life that had moved from the shadows of Rome into the gentler light of Ferrara. Yet even in the softness of song, dissonance could be heard. For though she created beauty around her, the old legends remained, echoing from afar, woven into the fabric of her name. It is tempting to see in her Ferrara years a kind of redemption, a clearing of her image, a reclaiming of her dignity. And perhaps it was so, at least in part. But even redemption cannot erase what has already been written in rumor and memory. The world outside Ferrara still imagined her as the Femme Fatale of Rome, the woman whose touch was said to bring death, whose smile was suspected of concealing secrets. Within Ferrara, she lived another life, quiet and graceful. Between the two, she walked as between two worlds, each incomplete, neither wholly true nor wholly false. As the melody faded into the evening, the palace gardens grew still. The flowers closed their petals, the fountains whispered more softly, and night descended. In the silence that followed, another sound emerged, the faint cry of a newborn, fragile, uncertain, breaking into the air only to fade again into silence. For even in the beauty of Ferrara, Lucrezia's life was marked by the joys and sorrows of motherhood, where each birth was shadowed by the possibility of loss, and each child carried the fragile promise of legacy. The faint cry of a newborn rose in the stillness, fragile and uncertain, a sound that seemed both promise and plea. It echoed softly through the chambers of Ferrara, then faded, leaving silence in its wake. For Lucrezia Borgia, motherhood was always this delicate balance between joy and sorrow, each infant's cry a reminder of life's tender beginnings and of how easily that tender spark could be extinguished. Her years in Ferrara were marked by many pregnancies, by the rhythm of expectation, birth, and too often grief. She bore children for Alfonso d'Este, fulfilling her role as duchess, securing the line of succession, and offering her family new bonds of loyalty. Yet of the children born to her, not all survived. Some were taken in infancy, their brief lives measured in days or months, leaving behind only the memory of small faces and the ache of empty arms. Others grew, carrying her legacy onward. To lose a child in that age was no rare tragedy, yet for a mother the wound was no less deep. One imagines her seated in a quiet chamber, rocking an infant to sleep, her face serene but her eyes shadowed by knowledge. For she knew too well that each child's life was precarious, that fever or frailty could strike at any moment, that no prayer, however fervent, could guarantee survival. The cry of a newborn, so full of hope, carried always the echo of silence waiting beyond it. And yet she welcomed each child, gave her love freely, and carried her grief with the same composure she had carried scandal and rumor before. Letters from Ferrara hint at this tenderness. They speak of her concern for her children, her care in overseeing their upbringing, her devotion to their welfare. In these moments we see not the femme fatale of legend, nor the political pawn of her father's Rome, but a woman whose life was defined as much by the cradle as by the throne. The maternal side of Lucrezia, though less spoken of in the centuries that followed, was perhaps the truest expression of who she was. For here she could act not as instrument of alliance, but as mother, giving love that was her own to give. Yet even here, sorrow followed. Some of her children lived only a short while, their names scarcely recorded before fading into the silence of memory. Each loss must have weighed heavily, pressing upon her heart with a grief she could not display too openly. For as Duchess, she was expected to embody dignity, to show composure even in mourning. The tears she shed may have been in private, behind closed doors, where only the shadows bore witness. Still, there were moments of joy. Her son Ercole, who would one day inherit Ferrara, was born of her union with Alfonso. Through him, her line continued, her place in Ferrara secured. Other children, too, grew at her side, each bringing laughter to the palace halls, each giving her a sense of continuity. Perhaps in their smiles, she found comfort, a reminder that despite loss, life endured, and through them, her own story would ripple into the future. The role of mother deepened her image in Ferrara. To her subjects, she was not only Duchess, but also a woman of compassion, one who understood sorrow and yet moved with grace. Stories survive of her kindness toward women in childbirth, of her generosity to convents that cared for orphans, of her devotion to the sick. Perhaps her own experiences of motherhood, its fragility, its mixture of joy and pain, shaped her empathy, teaching her to extend care beyond her own family to the wider circle of her people. It is striking to reflect on how different her life in Ferrara was from the image painted of her in Rome. There she had been whispered of as seductress, poisoner, partner in sin. Here she was known as mother, patroness, benefactress. Both images coexisted, separated by distance, and perhaps she knew that the truth lay not in either extreme, but in the complexity between them. A woman of contradictions, as all are, but more so, for her contradictions were magnified by the gaze of history. The cry of a newborn fading into silence is more than the sound of one life beginning and another ending. It is also the sound of time itself, of generations passing, of memory shifting. For Lucrezia, each child marked a new chapter, yet each loss reminded her of mortality. She lived not in the eternal certainty of legend, but in the fragile reality of human life, where joy and grief are bound together, inseparable as shadow and light. One wonders whether, in the quiet of night, she ever thought of her own mother, Vanozza de Catane, and the childhood she herself had known under the shadow of papal ambition. Did she think of how little control she had over her youth, how she was given and taken in marriage, how her name was shaped by rumor? Did she wish for something different for her own children, a life less entangled with scandal, a fate less heavy with expectation? Perhaps her prayers, whispered softly in chapel or chamber, were not for herself, but for them, that they might find peace where she had found only rumor and sorrow. And so the palace of Ferrara echoed with both music and lullabies, with laughter and with mourning. The Duchess walked its halls carrying her infants, listening for their cries, fearing their silences. She lived as all mothers do, with love that is both joy and vulnerability, knowing that every embrace holds the possibility of loss. As the last faint echo of the newborn's cry faded, another image arose to carry the story onward. A sealed letter placed carefully into a courier's satchel, destined for distant courts. For even as Lucrezia lived as mother and duchess, her role as intermediary in the affairs of Europe grew, and her pen became as powerful as her presence. The sealed letter rested within the courier's satchel, its wax still warm from the imprint of a signet ring, carrying with it not only words, but the weight of trust. It was through such letters that Lucrezia Borgia extended her influence beyond Ferrara, weaving her presence into the vast and tangled web of Renaissance politics. While her father and brother had wielded power with open ambition, she learned to wield it quietly, through ink and parchment, through diplomacy and intercession. Her role as Duchess was not confined to the household or the nursery. She became a vital intermediary, a woman whose letters passed between courts, whose counsel was sought in disputes, whose grace softened the sharp edges of political tension. Ferrara, though smaller than Rome or Milan, was a city of significance, and Lucrezia's presence within it gave her both authority and reach. She corresponded with popes, princes, and noblewomen, her words carrying both courtesy and subtle persuasion. In an age when women were often excluded from the affairs of state, she carved a space for herself through patience, intelligence, and composure. It was said that she possessed a gift for reconciliation. When conflicts arose, she did not inflame them, but sought to ease them, to find a path that allowed pride to remain intact while peace was preserved. Her letters, though polite, revealed careful thought, each phrase chosen with the precision of one who knew the dangers of misstep. In this, she was not unlike a musician, tuning the strings of discourse so that harmony might emerge where discord threatened. Perhaps this quality, more than beauty or rumor, was the truest measure of her strength. What is most remarkable is that her political presence was acknowledged even by those who distrusted her family. Ambassadors who visited Ferrara wrote of her wisdom, of her ability to listen without haste, of her steady composure. Some who had expected to find in her the infamous figure of scandal were surprised to encounter a woman of dignity, one who carried herself not as seductress, but as stateswoman. Yet the paradox remained. The world beyond Ferrara continued to imagine her in darker hues, while within the city she was respected for her clarity and judgment. Her authority extended also to religious and civic life. She supported convents, interceded on behalf of petitioners, and ensured the well-being of those who served under her. These acts were not merely gestures, but part of the fabric of her role, demonstrating that power could be exercised not only through force but through mercy. And yet her mercy was no sign of weakness. Behind her gentleness lay a firm understanding of her position, of what was required to preserve stability in a court where alliances could shift with alarming speed. One can imagine her seated at a desk, the light of a single candle falling upon parchment, her hand moving steadily as she composed her words. Outside, the gardens might echo with music, the city might bustle with trade, but within that quiet chamber she shaped the destinies of men and women beyond her sight. The scratching of the quill upon paper became as decisive as the clash of swords upon the battlefield, though its sound was softer, almost invisible. Did she ever reflect on the contrast between her life and that of her brother Cesare, who ruled with violence and terror, while she ruled with letters and presence? Did she see herself as his opposite, or merely as another branch of the same tree, bound to the same root of ambition? The sealed letters traveled far, to Rome, to Florence, to Venice, to Spain. Each bore her name, her seal, her words. Some were filled with requests for peace, others with gratitude, still others with the subtle shaping of alliances. In each she revealed not only intelligence but restraint, the capacity to move within the boundaries of her role without overstepping, and yet within that restraint there was power. Those who received her letters could not dismiss them, for they carried the weight of a duchess, the daughter of a pope, the sister of Cesare Borgia, and the wife of Alfonso d'Este. In these years, Lucrezia came as close as she ever would to shaping her own destiny. She was no longer the pawn of her father, nor the widow marked by her brother's cruelty, but a duchess respected in her own right. She had transformed from rumor into reality, from shadow into substance, Yet even here, the duality remained. Beyond Ferrara, her image was still painted in scandal. Within it, she was seen as wise, gracious, and capable. Perhaps she understood that one cannot erase legend, but one can live in such a way that the legend becomes only part of the story, not its entirety. The sealed letter, carried away by the courier, was more than parchment and ink. It was a symbol of her presence across distances, her quiet hand extended into the vast stage of Italy. As the courier departed, the sound of hooves upon the road faded, and in the silence that followed, another image emerged, a golden ring glinting in the candlelight, a reminder of the legends that still clung to her, of the stories of poison and hidden vials that no letter could dispel. The golden ring caught the glow of the candle, its surface gleaming as though it held a secret of its own. In the stillness of the chamber, such a ring seemed more than ornament. It became a symbol, a vessel of legend. For in the stories told of Lucrezia Borgia, the ring was said to hide poison, its gem concealing a cavity where death could be stored, ready to be slipped into a cup or onto a morsel of food. Whether such a ring ever existed, we cannot know. But the legend grew until it became inseparable from her name, a story repeated in courts and chronicles alike, shaping her image as the femme fatale of Renaissance Rome. Why did this legend take hold so firmly? Perhaps because her family's enemies needed such tales to give shape to their hatred. Alexander VI was condemned for his corruption, Cesare for his ruthlessness, and Lucrezia, being woman, was given the role of seductress, poisoner, corrupter of men. In an age when power was often expressed through male violence, the imagination cast its fears upon women in subtler, more insidious forms. Thus, Lucrezia was transformed into the archetype of the dangerous woman, her beauty a mask for lethal intent, her gentle smile the prelude to ruin. And yet, if we search for truth, little evidence appears. There are no records of her ever administering poison, no testimony that proves her hand guilty of such acts. The stories arose from rumor, from envy, from the need to explain the sudden deaths that seemed to cluster around the Borgias. When a rival died unexpectedly, the whisper spread. Lucrezia had poured the wine. Lucrezia had smiled as he drank. Lucrezia had worn the golden ring. Truth or falsehood mattered less than repetition, and repetition forged legend more enduring than fact. What must it have been like for her to know that wherever she went, eyes followed not only her beauty, but the suspicion of danger? Did she wear her jewels with pride or with awareness that others saw in them the glint of hidden malice? Did she lift her cup at banquets with a smile, knowing that others whispered of poison even as they returned her toast? Silence was again her only shield. To protest would be futile, for denial often feeds suspicion more than it dispels it. The legend of poison was not the only shadow. Tales of her liaisons, of secret affairs, of a body as dangerous as it was beautiful, wove themselves into her story until she seemed less a woman than a myth. Chroniclers of later centuries embellished these tales, turning her into a figure of Gothic fascination, a symbol of the Renaissance's darkest desires. Painters imagined her with golden hair and a chalice in hand. Dramatists gave her words she never spoke. Poets made her both muse and monster. The real Lucrezia receded, replaced by an invention more alluring to imagination than truth could ever be. Yet even as the legends grew, within Ferrara she lived a different life, one of governance, patronage, and quiet dignity. The citizens of her duchy did not see her as poisoner, but as benefactress. To them, the golden ring was not a symbol of death, but of wealth and refinement. It is a paradox that reveals much about history itself, that the same woman could be remembered in one place as virtuous and in another as villainous. That myth could overshadow reality until the two were indistinguishable. Still, the image of the golden ring endures. Perhaps it endures because it is so perfectly symbolic, small, beautiful, delicate, yet containing within it the possibility of death. It embodies the fear that beauty conceals danger, that love hides betrayal, that innocence masks sin. It is the fear that haunted men of power in an age when alliances were fragile, and it was easy to imagine that a woman's smile might undo what armies had won. Lucrezia became the vessel for this fear, her name a canvas upon which others painted their anxieties. If she ever reflected upon these tales, we cannot know, but one imagines her in a chapel, the light of candles flickering upon her face, her hands clasped in prayer, her eyes lowered in devotion. Did she whisper prayers for forgiveness of sins never committed, simply because the world insisted upon her guilt? Or did she pray for strength to endure the endless burden of suspicion, knowing that truth was powerless against legend? The golden ring glowed in the candlelight, both real and imagined, both jewel and symbol. It is left for us to wonder whether she ever wore such a ring, or whether it was only the invention of fearful minds. The truth, as always in her story, lies hidden behind silence, leaving us with questions that linger like the flicker of flame upon gold. As the candlelight dimmed, the scent of incense began to rise, filling the empty chapel with its sweetness. The golden ring vanished into shadow, replaced by the fragrance of devotion, the image of a woman seeking solace in prayer, turning her life not toward poison and sin, but toward piety and charity. The incense curled upward in pale streams, filling the empty chapel with its sweetness, clinging to the stone walls as though unwilling to dissipate. In that fragrance lingered something of Lucrezia Borgia's later years, when the woman once whispered of as poisoner and temptress turned her face toward piety, toward gestures of devotion that seemed to stand in contradiction to the legends that surrounded her. In Ferrara, where her life unfolded with steadier rhythm than in Rome, she gave generously to convents, aided churches, and devoted herself to acts of charity. She endowed altars, supported nuns, and sent gifts to monasteries. To the city that had once greeted her with suspicion, these acts were not merely signs of her wealth, but of her faith. Citizens began to speak of her less as the daughter of a corrupt pope and more as a duchess who cared for the souls and welfare of her people. And yet, how are we to interpret this turn? Was it the natural inclination of a woman aging beyond youth, seeking solace in prayer and good works? Was it the sincere devotion of a soul wearied by scandal and grief, longing for peace in the presence of God? Or was it, as some have suggested, another mask, a careful construction to counter the darker image that followed her from Rome? The answer lies hidden in the incense, in the sweetness that fills the air but never allows itself to be held. She was seen often at prayer, her hands folded, her eyes lowered, her presence humble before the altar. Yet the same eyes that glowed in candlelight had once been accused of concealing poison. The same hands that turned pages of psalters had once been imagined pouring death into cups. This duality deepened her mystery rather than resolved it, for to some, her piety was proof of innocence. To others, it was only the performance of a woman too skilled in artifice to leave any gesture uncalculated. Still, her devotion to the convents of Ferrara left tangible marks. She maintained close ties with the Sisters of San Bernardino and Corpus Domini, not merely as benefactress, but as friend. She corresponded with them, visited them, confided in them. Within the walls of convents, perhaps she found a kind of refuge unavailable in courts, a space where she might breathe free of the gaze of politics and rumor. Did she confess her griefs there, her regrets, her fears? Or did she maintain, even with them, the silence that had been her shield all her life? It is said that in her final years, her clothing grew plainer, her jewels worn less often, her time spent more in prayer than in festivity. Yet she did not retreat entirely from courtly life. She continued to host, to receive, to act as duchess. Her duality remained, outwardly the cultured lady of Ferrara, inwardly the penitent woman of faith. The contradiction was never resolved, but perhaps resolution was never her goal. Perhaps her life was not a matter of choosing between innocence and guilt, piety and sin, but of inhabiting all at once, as humans often must. The incense lingered in the chapel, heavy and sweet, masking the faint scent of old stone and candle wax. It is easy to imagine her seated there, cloaked in the fragrance, whispering prayers not for her own salvation, but for her children, her city, her family's restless souls. Did she pray for her father, whose papacy had been denounced as corrupt? Did she pray for Cesare, whose ambition had consumed him? Did she pray for Alfonso of Aragon, whose death she had wept, or for Juan, whose body had drifted in the Tiber? The prayers of a mother, a sister, a daughter. Perhaps they rose with the incense, unseen, unheard, yet not entirely lost. Her piety, like everything in her life, was observed and judged. To some, it redeemed her. To others, it was hypocrisy. Yet what matters more is what it gave to her. For in the rhythm of prayer, in the act of giving, she may have found peace, however fleeting. Her life had been shaped by forces she could not control, her name by rumors she could not silence, but in devotion she found a space that was hers alone, unseen by gossip, untouched by scandal. The chapel grows still in imagination, the incense slowly fading into the stones, the echoes of whispered prayers lingering like a breath. And as the air clears, another sound emerges, distant yet distinct, the toll of a funeral bell, heavy and solemn, marking not only devotion but decline, not only prayer but the passage into mortality. The toll of the funeral bell carried across the city, low and resonant, each stroke a reminder of the passage of time, each vibration lingering in the air as though unwilling to fade. For Lucrezia Borgia, those tolling bells came to mark the slow decline of her health, the steady weight of grief, and the burdens she bore as daughter of a pope, sister of Cesare, and Duchess of Ferrara. By the second decade of the 16th century, the years had laid their claim upon her. She was no longer the youthful bride whispered of in Rome, nor the tender mother cradling newborns, but a woman who had endured scandal, sorrow, and repeated loss. Childbirths, miscarriages, and the relentless rhythm of pregnancies had weakened her body. Each child carried hope, but each birth exacted a toll, and her strength diminished gradually, like a flame flickering lower with every gust of wind. Her griefs, too, pressed heavily. Her father, Alexander VI, was long dead. His papacy remembered more for corruption than piety. Her brother Cesare, once so feared, had fallen from power and met his end in exile, his body pierced by lances upon a foreign field. News of his death must have reached her like a shadow settling across her chamber. Her brilliant, ruthless brother, whose ambitions had shaped her fate, reduced to a corpse upon the road. Did she weep for him, or did she only bow her head in resignation, knowing that his fall was as inevitable as his rise had once seemed unstoppable? Loss upon loss compounded her weariness. Some of her children did not survive into adulthood. Those who did became her comfort, yet even in their smiles she must have seen the faces of those she had buried. A mother carries such absences within her, the silence of children who no longer cry. And beyond the personal griefs, the burden of her family's name never lifted. Though in Ferrara she was respected, admired even, the world beyond still repeated the old tales. The femme fatale of Rome, the poisoner, the temptress, such was the image that endured, no matter how she prayed, how she gave, how she lived. What must it have been? to feel her body failing while her name continued to live a life of its own, detached from her reality. Perhaps in moments of reflection she accepted the contradiction, as she had accepted so much else. Or perhaps she longed for truth to be known, for her children and her people to remember her not as myth, but as woman. We cannot know. Silence, as always, surrounds her truest thoughts. In her final years, her devotion deepened. She spent more time in chapels, more time in acts of charity. She supported convents not only with wealth, but with presence, visiting them, speaking with the sisters, finding in their cloisters a quietude that courts could never give. It was as though she was already preparing herself for departure, her eyes turning gradually away from the world toward the eternity she sought in prayer. Yet even in devotion, sorrow lingered. Her body was frail, her health failing, her strength diminished. The bells tolled often for others, and in their echo she may have heard the tolling that awaited her. Her final illness came in 1519, after giving birth to her last child, who did not survive. The strain of childbirth, endured so many times, proved too great. She weakened, slipping gradually toward death. Accounts speak of her facing this with dignity, her faith unshaken, her composure steady. She was only 39 years old, yet her life had encompassed enough rumor, tragedy, and transformation to fill several lifetimes. As she lay dying, did she think of Rome, of the gardens where she had played as a child, of the candle-lit chambers where she had been dressed as a bride, of the steps stained with Alfonso's blood, of the river where Juan had been found? Did she think of Cesare, his fierce eyes dimmed forever, or of her father, whose shadow she could never escape? Or did she turn her thoughts only to her children, praying that their lives would be freer, gentler, less burdened than her own? The funeral bell tolled again, its solemn voice carrying through Ferrara. The Duchess, who had once entered the city as a figure of suspicion, whispered of as the poisoner's daughter, was now mourned as a benefactress and mother. The people grieved her sincerely, for they had come to know her not as legend, but as presence. The city that had once doubted her now wept for her, and within its walls she was remembered with reverence. The bell's toll grew softer in imagination, fading into distance, its sounds swallowed by silence, and in that silence another image arose, a shroud folded gently over pale hands, the final gesture of a life that had been bound by power, by rumor, by sorrow, and yet also by resilience. The shroud was folded carefully over pale hands, the linen soft and white, a final covering for the woman whose life had been a tapestry of rumor, scandal, sorrow, and quiet strength. In the summer of 1519, within the city of Ferrara, Lucrezia Borgia passed from this world, leaving behind not only children and a duchy, but also an image that would echo across centuries. She was 39 years old, neither young nor old, but worn by the burdens of repeated childbirth, by the grief of too many losses, and by the relentless demands of a name that was never hers alone. Her death came after her final childbirth, a daughter who did not survive. The labor weakened her beyond recovery. Those who witnessed her last days wrote of her calmness, her patience in suffering, her steady faith as she approached the end. Perhaps in those final hours she found the peace that had eluded her in life, the stillness that no rumor could disturb, the silence that was hers alone. The chapel where she had so often prayed now became the place where prayers rose for her, whispered by nuns, sung by choirs, mourned by citizens who had come to love her. Her funeral was conducted with dignity, and the people of Ferrara grieved sincerely. Bells tolled throughout the city, their solemn voices marking not scandal but loss. To those who had lived under her care, she was remembered as generous and kind, a duchess who had given alms, who had interceded on behalf of the needy, who had supported convents and softened the severity of governance with her gentleness. In Ferrara, She was not the poisoner of legend, but the benefactress of memory. Not a femme fatale, but a mother whose presence had shaped the life of the court. Yet even as she was mourned, the shadows of her name lingered beyond the city's walls. In Rome, in Florence, in distant lands, chroniclers repeated the tales that had long surrounded her, the poison rings, the incest, the whispered betrayals. Her death did not silence these stories. It gave them a new poignancy, as though the ending of her life completed the legend. The pale hands beneath the shroud became, in imagination, the hands that had once poured poison, that had once caressed forbidden lovers, that had once concealed secrets. Truth or falsehood mattered little. In the centuries to come, poets and painters would choose which Lucrezia to remember, the saintly Duchess of Ferrara or the dark enchantress of Rome. What did she see in her final moments as her eyes closed for the last time? Perhaps she saw the faces of her children, those living and those lost, each gathered in memory like fragile flames. Perhaps she saw her father, smiling with the pride that had once both cherished and used her. Perhaps she saw Cesare, her brother, whose fate was so bound to hers, his ambition burning even in memory. Or perhaps she saw nothing but light, the soft glow that comes when pain recedes and the soul lets go of the body. The image of the shroud, folded over pale hands, carries with it a serenity that her life seldom knew. It is the stillness that comes only at the end, when no more accusations can wound, no more alliances can bind, no more whispers can cling. For all her years of silence, of living in the shadows of rumor, this was the silence that was truly her own. And yet, even as we imagine her resting in quiet, we must acknowledge the duality of her legacy. For to those who loved her, she was remembered with reverence. To those who hated her family, she remained a symbol of corruption. Perhaps this is the deepest truth of her story, that she could be at once both victim and villain, both mother and poisoner, both woman and myth. Her body was laid to rest in the convent of Corpus Domini, the place she had so often visited in life, where she had prayed, where she had given gifts. There, among the sisters who had known her kindness, she was buried, her presence lingering in the cloistered walls. Visitors who came in later years would pause before her tomb, some in reverence, others in curiosity, each bringing their own image of who she had been. The stone bore her name, but not her story, for her story was already too vast, too contradictory, too shrouded in both incense and shadow. The shroud folds gently still in memory, covering her hands, covering her face, covering the contradictions of her life. And as it lies there, unmoving, another image rises in its place, a faded fresco on a convent wall, its colors dimmed by time, its outlines blurred, yet still discernible. In that fresco lies the memory of Lucrezia as she was seen in Ferrara, not in Rome, a woman remembered with gentleness, with gratitude, with devotion, her legend softened into something human. The faded fresco lingered on the convent wall, its colors muted by centuries, the outlines softened by time. Yet even in its dimness, the figure could still be discerned, a reminder that memory does not vanish but transforms, taking on the hues of those who choose to remember. So it was with Lucrezia Borgia in Ferrara. Within that city she had lived, governed, prayed, and died. Within its walls, her image endured not as the infamous Femme Fatale of Rome, but as a duchess of dignity, a benefactress, a woman of kindness whose presence had left a gentler mark than rumor would allow. The nuns of Corpus Domini, who had known her in life, remembered her not with suspicion but with devotion. To them she had been a friend, a patron, and in her final days a sister in suffering. They told of her generosity, of her humility, of her quiet faith. When they prayed beside her tomb, it was not for the soul of a poisoner, but for the soul of a a duchess, a woman who had borne grief with composure. For them, the incense of her prayers lingered still, woven into the stones of the convent, rising invisibly toward heaven. Among the citizens of Ferrara, too, her memory softened. They spoke of her as one who had interceded for the poor, who had shown compassion, who had brought grace to their city. Festivals she had patronized, churches she had adorned, families she had aided. These remained in their recollections far more vividly than the distant rumors of Rome. For those who had seen her walk through the streets, her composure was more real than any tale of poison rings. To them, she was not legend but presence, not rumor but reality. And yet, beyond Ferrara, the legend of Lucrezia took a different form. In the courts of Italy and the chronicles of Europe, the old tales of scandal persisted. Chroniclers repeated Giovanni Sforza's accusations, repeated the whispers of incest, repeated the stories of poison and intrigue. They painted her as dangerous, seductive, corrupt, a mirror of the fears and desires of their age. For in the imagination of outsiders, the Borgias could never be ordinary. They were symbols of ambition, of corruption, of sin dressed in splendor. And Lucrezia, being woman, became the embodiment of that sin, the vessel into which envy and suspicion poured their darkest fantasies. Thus her memory divided itself, like the fresco with its fading colors. In Ferrara, she was remembered with affection. In the wider world, she was remembered with scandal. Which memory is closer to truth? Perhaps both, perhaps neither. For the truth of a life is always more complex than either devotion or slander allows. Lucrezia was at once duchess and daughter, mother and widow, benefactress and accused. She was all of these and more, and in the end she remained a mystery, her silence deeper than any words spoken about her. One wonders whether she foresaw this division of memory, whether she knew that she would be remembered differently in different places. Did she hope that Ferrara would preserve her truer image, while Rome would cling forever to its scandal? Did she care, in her final days, how history would speak her name? Or did she surrender such questions to the flow of time, knowing that memory, like frescoes, fades and transforms beyond the control of those it depicts? The fresco on the convent wall, though faded, still retains a presence. Visitors pause before it, their eyes tracing outlines softened yet enduring. They see not the glittering poisoner of legend, but a woman cloaked in serenity, her gaze lowered in prayer. And in that faint image lies perhaps the truest memory of her, not because it is free of legend, but because it accepts the passage of time, the inevitability of transformation. Outside the convent, history moved on. The Este family faced new challenges. Italy itself was torn by wars and invasions, and the memory of Lucrezia became part of the city's fabric, woven into its identity as quietly as ivy climbs stone. She was no longer a figure of daily presence, but of remembered kindness, whispered of in prayers, recalled in stories told to children. For Ferrara, she was not a figure of fear, but of affection, not a stain, but a blessing. And yet, beyond those walls, her name continued to wander, reshaped by pen and brush, turned into something far removed from the duchess who had walked among gardens and chapels. In distant lands, writers and painters would claim her story, retelling it in forms that suited their imagination, often far from truth. The fresco within Ferrara and the tales outside it diverged, like two paths leading away from the same source. One path softened with devotion, the other darkened with legend. As the fresco faded further, as centuries passed, its image grew fainter, yet the very act of its endurance reminded the world that memory is not only written in books, but painted in hearts, in walls, in whispers that refuse to vanish. and as the image dimmed, another sound arose to carry the story forward, the scratching of a quill upon parchment, unfinished, as if history itself had paused mid-sentence, unsure of which Lucrezia to record, the Duchess of Ferrara, or the Femme Fatale of Rome. The scratching of a quill upon parchment, faint and deliberate, carried forward through time, its ink marking not only words but shaping memory. With each stroke, Lucrezia Borgia was written anew, her image reimagined by those who never saw her face, who never walked beside her in Ferrara, who knew her only as a figure painted by rumor. In the centuries after her death, the quill became her truest companion, for through it, her name lived on, not as she was, but as she was imagined. The writers of later ages found in her the perfect subject. To moralists, she was the warning, the proof that beauty concealed corruption, that the church itself had been tainted by the sins of those who ruled it. To dramatists, she was the femme fatale, the golden-haired enchantress, whose smile hid daggers, whose lips concealed poison, whose heart was bound to forbidden desires. To poets, she was the muse of contradiction, at once angel and demon, victim and villain. In each telling, she was less a woman than a symbol, less a Duchess of Ferrara than an embodiment of Renaissance darkness. Painters, too, claimed her. In canvases and frescoes long after her death, women with pale faces and golden hair were labeled Lucrezia Borgia, even when they bore no likeness to her. She became a type, a character, more than an individual. The ring gleaming with imagined poison, the chalice lifted with hidden intent, the eyes lowered with deceptive modesty, these became the visual language of her legend, the true woman who had written letters, given alms, prayed in chapels, held infants in her arms, reseated behind the painted mask. The romantic age of the 19th century revived her with particular fervor. Writers fascinated by decadence and corruption returned to her name as though it contained all the mysteries of sin and beauty. Plays and operas bore her likeness, novels reimagined her intrigues, and audiences thrilled at the tales of scandal given dramatic life. She was transformed again, no longer only the Renaissance Duchess, but also the Gothic heroine, the eternal seductress whose story could be retold in any age that feared or desired the mingling of beauty and destruction. Why did she endure so strongly in legend? Perhaps because her life contained just enough shadow to invite embellishment and just enough silence to resist refutation. She had left no confessions, no memoirs, no words in which to claim her own truth. Into that silence, others poured their inventions, and because she was a woman, her silence was filled not with neutral images, but with those shaped by the fears and fantasies of men. She became what they most dreaded and most desired, the woman whose love brings ruin, the daughter whose obedience hides sin, the widow whose sorrow masks complicity. The quill scratched on, century after century, reshaping her until the distance between the real and the imagined grew unbridgeable. The Lucrezia of Ferrara, the Duchess, the mother, the patroness, was remembered faintly, like the faded fresco upon the convent wall. The Lucrezia of legend, the poisoner, the enchantress, the dark desire of Rome, was remembered vividly, inscribed in plays, paintings, and stories that carried her name to lands she had never seen. Yet even in this one senses a paradox. For if she had not been transformed into myth, would her name have endured at all? Would the Duchess of Ferrara, remembered locally with devotion, be known beyond the city if not for the scandal that clung to her? Perhaps her legend, though unjust, ensured her immortality. Perhaps it is the fate of some to be remembered not as they were, but as they were imagined. And perhaps, in the end, this imagined Lucrezia tells us less about her and more about those who shaped her image, revealing their fears, their desires, their fascination with the mingling of innocence and sin. What would she have thought? Could she have read the pages written about her centuries later? Would she have raged at the lies or laughed at the absurdity? Would she have wept at the distortion or accepted with resignation that legend is stronger than truth? We cannot know. Her silence remains, and into it we still write, still paint, still invent. The scratching of the quill upon parchment grows fainter, the ink drying upon unfinished lines. The legend stands, yet the truth remains hidden, like a figure glimpsed behind a curtain, never fully revealed. And as the quill falls still, another sound emerges, footsteps fading down an empty corridor, vanishing into silence, leaving behind only questions that no parchment, no brush, no stage can ever resolve. The footsteps echoed down the corridor, soft at first and then fainter, until they vanished into silence. In that silence remains the question that has haunted Lucrezia Borgia's story across centuries. Who was she, truly? Was she the villainess that chroniclers painted, the poisoner whose ring gleamed with hidden death, the enchantress who bound father and brother in forbidden desires? Or was she the victim, the daughter offered as pawn, the widow grieving beside a murdered husband, the mother weeping for infants lost, the duchess remembered with tenderness in Ferrara? The footsteps fade, but the question remains, unanswered, unresolved. To approach Lucrezia is to enter a hall of mirrors. Each reflection shows a different face, each shaped by the angle of history and the imagination of those who looked upon her. In Rome, she is remembered through the whispers of scandal, the tales of incest, the rumors of poison. In Ferrara, she is remembered through acts of charity, devotion, and maternal care. Later centuries preferred the darker reflection, for it thrilled the imagination and lent itself to stories of corruption. Yet in the faded fresco of the convent, another reflection lingers, gentler, humbler, quieter. Which is the truer image? Perhaps both are shadows of a reality too complex to capture in words. Her life was bound from birth to forces greater than herself. As daughter of Rodrigo Borgia, later Alexander VI, and she was never free to choose her path. She was given and taken in marriage to secure alliances, annulled and widowed, used as instrument of politics. The choices she made were within the narrow space allowed her, and within that space she moved with dignity, composure, and silence. Her silence has been both her shield and her curse. It protected her in life, but in death it allowed others to speak for her, to invent her anew, to shape her into myth. Yet myths, however unjust, carry power. They outlast the moment of living truth. They endure where memory falters. The Lucrezia who walks through history is both real and imagined, both woman and symbol. She is the embodiment of Renaissance contradictions, beauty and corruption, innocence and sin, devotion and betrayal. Her legend tells us as much about the fears and desires of her age, and of ages after hers, as it tells us about the woman herself. Perhaps it is fitting that her story ends not with certainty, but with ambiguity. For certainty belongs to chronicles, to records, to facts. Ambiguity belongs to memory, to legend, to the realm of the timeless. It is in ambiguity that Lucrezia's presence endures, neither condemned nor absolved, but suspended between victim and villain, between truth and invention. She remains a figure not to be solved, but to be contemplated, like a distant melody, whose notes cannot quite be caught. One imagines her still, walking slowly through a corridor lit by candlelight, her veil trailing, her footsteps soft upon the stone. Behind her follow the whispers, the rumors, the tales. Before her lies only silence. She does not turn. She does not speak. She moves onward into the stillness that no word can touch. In that movement she remains forever just beyond our grasp, forever a mystery. And so her story closes with the echo of those fading footsteps. They vanish into the corridor's silence, leaving us to wonder, to imagine, to reflect. Was she what they said she was, or something else entirely? Was she sinner, saint, seductress, or simply human? The answer lies not in certainty, but in the shadows she left behind, shadows that move still, long after her passing, in the timeless corridors of history. The corridor grows darker, the footsteps gone, the silence complete. Only the memory remains, fragile as candlelight, uncertain as rumor, enduring as legend. And in that silence, the listener too is left to drift into reflection, into doubt, into sleep.